Well, hello, everybody. I'm excited to have you join us today in our next DevSecOps bunch. It is the month of June, and that means it's debate month. So today we're going to have the great debate. Does DAST work for DevSecOps? As is customary in these sessions, we'll wait for a few seconds for folks to join here. So I'll fill until we get rolling. This session actually started because of a very interesting LinkedIn post by my friend Chris Romeo of Kerr, who's joining us today. And so Chris made a post that basically said, is DAST dead for DevSecOps or something to that effect? And so we got going on LinkedIn and I said, oh, heck, let's pull that across and bring that into the DevSecOps bunch. So that's kind of how we ended up here today. So as I said, we'll wait a second or two or three. I'm kind of watching my clock here to make sure we give people time to come in. As is usual for our webinars, we are recording today, so you get a copy of the recording within a few days. We'll also share the slides with you. At the end of the webinar is a quick survey, so please take the survey, let us know what you think. There's lots of links to other resources as we go through the session today as well, so you can take advantage of those, or hit us up on the website, or hit up Chris on LinkedIn, and he's got a bunch of resources he's going to share at the tail end as well. So with that, looks like it's a good time to get rolling. So welcome again. I'm Brian Reed. I'm the Chief Mobility Officer of NowSecure. I serve as evangelist and strategist and a whole bunch of other things, which otherwise means I talk too much. With me today is my old friend, Chris Romeo of Kerr. He was founder of Security Journey and has like 1 million years in security and threat modeling. And he's going to tell us all about his background as well. So for today's session, as I noted, we are recording. You also have the opportunity to ask questions, so please use the Q&A tab. A quick agenda, and then we'll get into intros. So beyond the intros, we're going to talk about testing techniques because we're going to argue about DAST. We need to explain what DAST is and all the other related technologies. We'll get into debate, summary, some other resources, and we'll be off and running. So with that, Chris, tell us about yourself and your background.
Sure thing. Thanks, Brian. Chris Romeo. I'm the CEO of Kerr. And as Brian said, I've been involved in the world of security for what seems like a long, long time. 26 years at last count, and I've had the opportunity to do a lot of different roles in that journey, from traveling security consultant, government security evaluator, pen tester, director of incident response. And then the last 12, 15 years or so, I've really honed in on the world of application security. As Brian said, I was previously at Security Journey, where I was the CEO and co-founder. And before that, I was at Cisco as the chief security advocate. Number of resources here already that you can use to find me. And just, a quick too long, didn't read, spoiler alert. The answer is no to the question Brian asked earlier. Does DAST work in DevSecOps? I had to fire some shots right off the top to make this interesting.
It's all good. It's all good. I beg to differ, but we've had parallel journeys. So I'm a mobile guy. So I started in application development and then landed in mobile. I go back to the world of BlackBerry and even some mobile stuff before that. So I've been doing a lot of mobile security, mobile development, mobile tools, mobile performance management, the APM market, all that other fun stuff for a whole lot of years. Here at NowSecure, we focus on mobile security. So you're joining us for a DevSecOps conversation, and I'll bring the mobile flavor in to that conversation. We do a lot with OWASP. We provide a full suite of testing, training, and services as part of our offerings. Kind of like Chris, we started with threat modeling and forensic analysis, and then that evolved into training, and that evolved into commercial software and commercial pen testing and all that great stuff. If you're heavy duty into reversing, you probably know Frida and Radare, and our research team created those. And we work with lots and lots and lots of companies who live on mobile or mobile's core to delivering their capabilities in the market. So let's barrel into app innovation, right? So when we think about where DevSecOps came from, or really DevOps, and then security got dragged along at some point later, most of this is about an innovation path. So as is customary every month, we kind of talk about why are we here in the first place? And so the whole world, Chris and I have been at this long enough that we lived through waterfall development, and that moved into agile development. And then that moved into, we need something faster and more iterative than agile, which got us to DevOps. But all of that is about innovation. So how do I move and fast moving, small incremental gains and drive those things forward so that I can achieve rapid release cycles, I can innovate quickly, I can try out new things, also fast fails in there, and there's all that great stuff. And so for a lot of us, the innovation like accelerated, and in many instances, development team lapped or rocketed past the security team as it got to faster and faster iterative release cycles. Now, security teams coming in with a different view that's like, hey, we got to protect that sensitive data. The developer wants the innovative features, and of course they want to write high quality apps. It's not that they want insecure apps, but the security professional tends to take the sensitive data approach. What is that sensitive data? How is it used, stored, transmitted? Do I even need to store and transmit it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And that kind of creates that natural tension. DevOps ran ahead. DevSecOps kind of trailed its way in there, and now many organizations are doing a lot more from a DevSecOps perspective, trying to bring security in. And as we do that, then that gets to techniques and tooling and strategies and standards and all that good stuff. We kind of need to figure out how those things come together. Chris, any thoughts to add on innovation colliding with sensitive data?
I want to highlight a word that you had on that first slide that I think we don't think about enough, and that's safely. Even the slide before this, right? You used the word safely. And lately I've been thinking a lot about the difference between security and safety. And when we think about it in the real world, for example, with airplanes, there's a big difference between airplane security and airplane safety. And so I really want to challenge our thinking as we go forward to say, how do we start to think more about safety in the world of technology and the world of security? Because there are a lot of things that we're doing. And I think of like mobile apps for as an example. There's plenty of mobile apps that provide GPS location and all kinds of private data and things like that. And so there is a safety angle. And that's a direction I think that we need to start thinking about as we go into the future, because classically we've thought security, privacy, we're over here, safety's way over here. And I think I love the fact that you put that word in here.
We are living in the same place. You're going to see a lot more coming from me as an evangelist and us as a company talking about safety and doing things safely, because that's what actually matters. So if we're going to talk about DAST, we need to talk about testing. So let's set up our smorgasbord of testing capabilities that various organizations are using in technologies. And as Chris and I were kind of putting this together, there's lots of different places to start. One of the sort of sneak peek on where we're going. So he said no, I'm going to say yes to answer to the question. But sneak peek is there's some really interesting characteristics around the difference between web and mobile architecture, right? So web was here first, mobile came second, right? But as we sort of think about how those different worlds work, you have this notion with a web app that you have a firewall and a DMZ and a bunch of logic and storage behind that, and that generally should be protected by layers of security. And then you have less code running in the browser. So whether it's 98% of the code or 90 or 50 or whatever percent of the code, a big chunk of your code is back behind layers of security. And then some of it's being delivered in a browser. In the mobile world, the entire mobile app lives on a device. And not every developer or non-technical person realizes that it's easy to reverse an app on iOS or Android and get to source or close to source. So what winds up happening now is that a lot of the IP, a lot of the logic, a lot of the user data, a lot of that sensitive data can be exposed on that client device because of the power of reversing tools and reverse engineering capabilities on the market today. So we need to think about this world where the architectures are different, and that actually drives architectural strategies for how you design your applications, web and mobile, differently. It also drives differences in testing, differences in threat modeling, and all of those kinds of things as we look at the two different sides. The last thing to add is that for a mobile app, in many instances, the developers left to write their own network security protocols, pick their own crypto, design their own storage APIs. And in that world, on a web world, the browser takes care of a lot of those things. I call HTTPS, and I get encrypted, tunnels. On the app side of the world, the developer has to handle that. So the opportunity for the developer to make a mistake in terms of properly doing storage or network or crypto or common functions like that is higher, which means the chance of vulnerability is higher than something that has some built-in protections in the web. So, Chris, what do you think about the differences here?
I think in general, I agree with where you're going and the differences between mobile and web applications. I guess a couple of things jump out at me when I look at how you're describing web applications, though. And you already highlighted the fact, 98% might not be the right number. I would say the bulk of API code sits behind perimeter, backend API sits behind perimeter and broad layer protection. Modern web applications are very much driven by web style front end, JavaScript style front ends, whether that's Angular, whether that's React, whether it's Vue. There's 100 different front end JavaScript frameworks that come with it. So I would say in the modern web application, we have a little more visibility than we used to, because we can grab an entire React front end from an application, and then we can start to analyze that offline and look for different ways it's interacting with API, and we can get some more perspective on the application. But I get what you're saying about the challenges or the things that the developer has to do on the mobile side. Definitely agree with you on that side.
So let's dig in a little further, right? So whoops, I double jumped. So there's got to be best practices for this. And so OWASP is a great resource for those who may be newer to our series or haven't attended any of our OWASP-oriented sessions. The great news is that the OWASP projects provide you with best practices on what you should do. So we can just simply look at like the ASVS and the MASVS, and they tell us what are the 14 control areas that I need to pay attention for web, what are the 8 control areas I need to pay attention for the MASVS. Some of our customers actually will have their developers read or leverage assets related to the MASVS to help them understand, well, what is threat modeling in a mobile world? What are important architecture things? What are the storage things I need to pay attention to? What does crypto mean in this world? And especially what is resilience and anti-tampering, which is V8. So we encourage you to take advantage of the OWASP resources out there. And of course, there's other books and trainings as well that we'll be sharing as we go through here.
Yeah, and I would add, let me talk about my perspective on first OWASP. To your point, OWASP it's such an excellent resource. There is nothing that compares to it in the world of application security. And so, I mean, I'm a lifetime member of OWASP. I love it so much. I love so many of the different projects that are out there. And between MASVS and ASVS, I recommend to people all the time, don't create your own set of requirements. The folks have already gone and spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours putting together such a detailed list of requirements that you can use for mobile and web applications. Like, if anything, take this as a beginning, and if you want to make some tweaks to it, do that. But these are such excellent documents, and I so highly recommend them to everybody that I meet.
And we also speak, both of us, a lot at OWASP events and provide supporting materials. Now I'm going to hand the whole threat modeling over to Chris, because he's the black belt here.
This is threat modeling, something that's so near and dear to my heart. And just in case folks don't really understand what threat modeling is, a very quick definition that comes from the Threat Modeling Manifesto, a document that a number of friends of mine and I put together to define the essence of threat modeling. Threat modeling is analyzing representations of a system to determine privacy and security challenges so you can fix them early in the life cycle. And so a representation could be something as simple as a diagram. It could be a conversation where Brian just explains to me what he's trying to build, and then I give him some thoughts about what I think it could go wrong with it. And so that's the general idea of threat modeling. And it's important that we're talking about it up front here after we talked about requirements. Requirements and threat modeling are very much interwoven together because they both share the same focus, the same idea. It's about building secure software. And so for me, when I think about threat modeling, this idea of analyzing something I'm going to build, but also secure architecture, how do I look at the entire picture of what I'm going to build? Both of these are our pillars of secure software foundation. And so it's time to be a little controversial, because that's the thing that I do now. But you'll see I've made a little bit of a joke here. Instead of shifting left, right, up, down, smart, and everywhere, let's focus on secure by design and secure by default. For me, shift left and all these other shifting things that are happening now and people are using, this has become a marketing term. It's not the essence of what it used to be. Joe Jarzenbeck back at DHS in the late 90s had this thing called build security in. It's the same thing that shifting left is describing, this idea of sprinkling security throughout the entire life cycle, whatever that life cycle is. And so for me, it's about secure by design and secure by default. Those are the two things we need to focus on. And just so you know, threat modeling is compatible with both Agile and DevOps. So threat modeling is consistent and it works with any methodology you have. It is agnostic to the methodology. Doesn't matter how you're building software. And I don't care, like you may say DevOps, oh, we go so fast. We don't have time to do anything like think about security. There is a stage in everybody's process where a developer / engineer grabs a piece of work that is scoped in some way by product management, and then they think about, what am I going to do to achieve that piece of work? And then they go write code. That time where you're thinking about that piece of work, that's where you can do threat modeling. So threat modeling is something that fits into every way of building software, and it's something that really everybody should do across our industry.
So go check out the Threat Modeling Manifesto, go take some courses. We strongly encourage you to dig into that. That is a high value place, and you don't have to be an expert. Just start down the path. All right, so lots and lots of tools often live in this "it takes a village" tool chain. So I'm gonna hit on some quick highlights. I'll kind of run us through the more common ones people use. So static scanning, right? Fast, often friction-free, except for the high volume of false positive rate. So you might need to tune it a bit. Pretty easy to configure, not a lot of complexity. And it's cool because if you're doing a static source code scanning, you can pinpoint the line of code when you have an issue. There are a few folks that have created IDE plugins for it and so on and so forth. You can get it natively inside of GitHub or GitLab. But really the challenges tend to be the high false positive rate and the coverage gaps that they leave. And that's why people often add DAST or pen testing or something else, because SAST is not complete coverage. Now, when you flip to DAST, DAST evolved years after SAST got started. And really it's the idea of running a binary to scan it for issues, right? So there are DAST tools that kind of run on demand where someone will configure them and push a start button and walk away. It might be walk away for a cup of coffee. It might be walk away and go take a vacation. And then you get the answer back a week later, depending on the complexity of the app and the tooling and whatever else. And there are some things that can run in a pipeline sometimes for those things. So while we look at it, because it allows us to cover what code actually runs at runtime when we test it, probably a point I should have included here, can be complex tuning, notoriously slow in the web world. And because you're analyzing a binary, you typically can't get back to the line of code. Chris, anything to add on SAST and DAST? Because I know we're going to destroy DAST later. So
I mean, you put comma pipeline, like, does it really work? I guess you can run it in the pipeline. I guess you didn't make any statement about comma pipeline in less than half of my life for it to
well, I did make
run.
the joke about a week, right? So vacations for a week. So
I think you've described these well, and I think I think this is a good foundation for us to begin.
So then two other techniques now that emerged in the last decade or so, IAST. So kind of in a world of trying to be better at DAST, maybe is the way some vendors think about it. The idea of IAST is there's some code that's included in your application during the development lifecycle. And so when that code runs, when your app runs, like in a QA pipeline test or on a developer's desktop, if that instrumentation code for IAST is included, it fires off telemetry. And then that telemetry you can collect and start using that. It's your classic telemetry probe, kind of in the code. What's kind of cool about IAST is if you've already built out a framework of automated testing, you may have automated UI testing, integration testing, unit testing, the IAST is always present, so it's going to collect telemetry as that runs. So some organizations actually don't need to do independent security scanning or have extra labor go on because they try to use IAST as a mechanism to do that. Config is usually low because you're just riding along with the code. Relatively new tech. It's kind of a love it or hate it. A lot of people don't even know about it side. Now that same sort of security SDK like technology for IAST can be left in during production. So now you've got users running the app in production, and that's going to collect security telemetry in production. That could detect vulnerabilities in the app, but that can also detect attacks to the app. So they could see probes potentially and do things like dynamically compensate by adjusting application behavior, tweaking a WAF, for example, on the perimeter or other security technology. There may be some code in your app that allows it to switch, say, authentication mechanisms or something else. RASP can be kind of low to medium config. It really does depend on like what level of functionality you want to turn on, whose technology you're using, and all the rest. Probably the biggest concerns I've heard about RASP is the concerns about performance in production. So, developers classically will say, anytime you add another SDK in or instrumentation in, are you just going to slow down my responsiveness? There are also some people concerned about potential security vulnerabilities that the RASP itself might create, because while it's in there trying to instrument and protect, is it actually an attack vector, or does it create security weaknesses in the app as well. So, Chris, your thoughts on IAST and RASP?
I'm a big fan of RASP. Let's start there. Like that, RASP is one of my common recommendations that I make for, especially on the web application side. I think it's very powerful. In my experience, the performance hit is not big enough to counter the benefits of having something that's watching every request come through and blocking those that are actually SQL injection, because it's watching the SQL statements and saying, whoa, this is about to run and go to the database and grab data it shouldn't grab. Like it's got that level of visibility. So I'm a giant fan of RASP. I would say not so much a fan of IAST, only because IAST is only as good as your test cases. You mentioned this earlier. And so for organizations that have excellent test cases, you know, both from a unit test and kind of a regression, being able to really try the feature kind of at a high level, whether that's UI driven or whatever they're doing. Like IAST works well if my test coverage is pushing 98% plus or higher. But if I have a low test coverage, I just can't exercise I can't tap into the capabilities of the IS because I'm not able to exercise the app in enough depth. And so that's the challenge that I have. I think people can fall into a little bit of a false sense of security here with IS because they think, oh, I ran my scans, I didn't get anything. Well, if you didn't have deep enough testing that you're using to drive the IS is not doing testing. The IS is sitting in watching for things to come into the application and get by any other security protections. But if you don't have the test cases to drive it, the results you can get kind of a false sense of security out of the results of IS.
That's a good point. I think to a large extent, most of the IS vendors have added or complemented with SAST or some other tooling because of that potential lack of code coverage. I'm not a huge fan of RASP. We haven't seen much success in mobile. Totally get the detecting cross-site scripting and some of the other more common web app issues. We don't see it deployed a lot in the market. There's limited vendor availability, but instead of RASP, what a lot of people do put out is application shielding and anti-tampering technology, right? Which is kind of not the same thing in an adjacent category. And I'm not going to go get buried in that in this call. Other two testing techniques, you're kind of crazy if you're not using SCA, right? So if half your app is third-party code, then you really ought to have some kind of scanning of that third-party code or something that attests that the third-party code, be it open source or commercial. Lots of different ways to do SCA scanning. Most of the application security testing vendors have some kind of SCA. The challenge is, a lot of it's commodity, but the challenges do tend to be around library coverage. I'll give you an example. A lot of the more well-known SCA vendors that do a great job with desktop and web have very few, if any, library data for mobile libraries. And so we've had to build our own because we couldn't find a partner who did it. So you may be using SCA, you might look carefully on the mobile side because a lot of the vendors don't really have much mobile coverage, but they got great, web and more traditional library coverage. Now, pen testing, I kind of combine these just so we could fit the slides. Pen testing is the throw bodies at it model, right? So you're going to use humans to help you with threat modeling, and they're going to use humans to do a deeper dive, expert, oriented teardown testing. And obviously, there's a lot of pen testing that we have been able to automate over time, but you still need the ingenuity and the expertise of the human. There's still things that only a human can probe, jumping through memory, looking at memory dumps, things like that. And so no matter what you're doing, if you're building a tier 1 high-risk application, periodically you should be doing pen testing in some way, shape, or form. But if it takes me 2 weeks to do a pen test, there's no way I can do it in 10 minutes in a build every day, right? So they're really expensive. Because the price, because the labor, they're the opposite of DevSecOps because they're all human labor. And so we need to find a way of how do we I think all of this debate today is going to be about how do you get as much coverage as you can with the speed you can to get to that safety moment, right? So Chris, thoughts on these?
Yeah, and I would even add to the end of that with a return on investment, right? That for me, that's always key. Like, is the tool providing me tangible value that I can define via metrics and share with the people who are signing the checks that drive my budget? So I would say from an SCA perspective, agree 100%. Like SCA is table stakes at this point for anybody that's doing anything. Now, the first time, if you have never run SCA, we tend as security people to trivialize the use of SCA now, but the first time you use SCA, if you've never used it before for an app that's existed for years, you're going to have a lot of work to do, and it's going to take a lot of engineering effort to upgrade the packages to get to where you need to be. So SCA is not unfortunately, it's not a simple button push and we're good to go, but it's something like it's table stakes for me and where we sit in the industry. I'm going to save pen testing. I know we're going to add that. We're going to cover that a little bit in the debate. I agree with the assessment of how you've described it here. My challenge, my issues with pen testing are not in what you've described. I agree that these are the capabilities it provides. These are the challenges. I have some other challenges, but we'll get into that here in a minute.
Well, that'll be more fun here in a few minutes. So before we get to the great debate, a couple last things to tie together. So this diagram actually came out of a workshop about 2 years ago, around the same time as that web versus mobile timeframe, that kind of talked about like, how do you try to align speed, coverage, performance, and all of that in some sort of a grid, because most organizations are running multiple tools. And you kind of see this natural pattern where things like SAST and SCA give you great speed, but not full coverage of everything, right? SCA is your third-party code, not your first-party code. SAST is looking at your source, but not necessarily behavior of the source. And then IAST is trying to run that tweener game, which works nicely for a smoke test, but there's the question of coverage. Maybe I'm going to invest in some DAST, but I don't do it every day in my DevSecOps pipeline. I do it periodically as a regression test pattern on a pre-release basis. And then once in a while, I need to do a pen test. And that's the only way I get maximum coverage. And the idea of the arrows, you can kind of put the arrow in the right place to help you dial in that triangulation of speed and coverage. And what this picture really tells us is that, if DevSecOps is about speed, then you can't be doing pen testing every day, but you can think about how do you dial these in to fit the right part of your testing strategy and really your development strategy overall in the pipeline. Thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, I think you forgot one line on here. There needs to be a dotted line that goes below IAST and above SAST, with an arrow that says DevSecOps this way.
Oh, that's a great point. That is a good point.
I'm starting the debate. I'm firing shots all the way through.
I've used this a few times, so we're going to add a dotted line in DSO. We'll have to do that offline, so I've got it for future use. I think you made a good point. I didn't plot like waterfall, agile, and DevSecOps. We probably should do that. There's probably some motion to it too. The question becomes, how does it move, if at all, over time, right? So the last thing we always need to think about, and Chris brought this up as we were preparing for today, is this notion that we keep waiting for the breakers to break stuff instead of focusing on the builders writing good stuff, right? So if you're from the OWASP world, you hear a lot about builder and breaker. And so let's think about bringing those two together. From threat modeling through training, through code reviews and everything else, what we really want to do is help with building better software. Right? And then the tools you choose just become a mechanism to validate that you are writing better software, not an exercise sort of in futility, trying to find every vulnerability on the planet and figure out what to fix. And so as we get through this cycle, I think we're going to have some good points, because we're not only going to talk about the tooling, but we're going to talk about the roles of these two audiences and how the modern DevSecOps pipeline should be bringing them together, and kind of some of the responsibilities and actions are now shifting as we evolve. Thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, I can't let this one go by without just stepping up onto my soapbox for a minute, for a soapbox moment. When I think about, as an industry, how much focus we put on the breaker side, it's painful for me, because and the way you can test this is if you ever run into a student who's studying cybersecurity in university, ask them this single question. Say, what do you want to do with this cybersecurity degree after you graduate? And 9 times out of 10, they'll say, I want to break stuff. I want to pen test. I want a red team. I want to just knock everything over. Hardly anybody will ever say, I want to write more secure software. I want to help development teams build more secure software. And so I think as an industry, we've put so much focus, because movies glamorize it, and everybody thinks that security is about breaking things. And so I want to challenge our thinking here as an industry. Everybody that's listening to this webinar or this recording, to say, let's focus more on the building side. If we invest more on teaching builders, in using things like OWASP to help the people that build software to write more secure software using threat modeling, using secure by design, using secure architecture. There's less things for the breakers to find. And it's a lot less expensive to do it with the builders than let the breakers find it in open tickets and go back to the builders.
I think that's awesome. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke at OWASP Pacific Northwest, and we were having a speakers dinner the night before. And one of the hosts of that OWASP event on the organizing board made an awesome statement of, my job is to put my team out of business and make the developers successful in building secure software. Right? He dreams of the day when he doesn't need a security team anymore. And I think that's really where we're trying to get to. Your comment about college, I think, is a great one. Yes, the development people about building safe software, they might look at you cross-eyed, because what they want to do is build innovative software and use cool tools. So there is a sociocultural change that we need to migrate through. That is, I think you mentioned airlines earlier, right? Airline engineers learn that they must build safe airplanes. Right? It's not about build it some kind of fast airplane and then see if the breakers can break it or crash it. So that mental model, I think, is hopefully some time we will get there. And I don't want to beat up on the developers. I totally get it. I was a developer early on. You don't want me writing code anymore. I know some of my code is still in production from the 90s. But in that world, we were running in waterfall. So we did take the time to try to do things right. And we had very careful testing. Today's a whole nother ballgame. I can't imagine writing some of the things that I did back then in today's world using the techniques we did. We would have to adapt dramatically now. So let's get into the pipeline and let's get into the debate. So when we think about a pipeline, if you're frequent on this event, we kind of have a pipeline structure, and then we tear down the pipeline and talk about different things that happen in the pipeline and where things go and where things break and so on and so forth. And so standardize, drive the skills in the team, set your requirements, write some code, commit it, build it, test it, fast feedback loops in the middle, stage, deploy, monitor in prod, rinse and repeat. I hate the infinity diagram. I prefer a flow diagram like this. You might be running a single pipe, you might be running parallel pipes, but something like this is what's going on in your org. And we're going to use this to structure our DAST debate here in a second. And where does everything go, right? So it's not like I do everything up front. So I should be thinking about using OWASP resources up front with the standards. I definitely should be threat modeling as I get into requirements and design. You want to look at how do you run SAST while coding at a minimum. Traditionally, things like SAST, maybe DAST and IAST live in the test phase. Pen testing is more like pre-release. And then, of course, we talked about RASP earlier, kind of running in production. So this kind of gives us a sense of where these things go. The challenge becomes, if I'm trying to run fast through this, how do I have a friction-free experience with as many of these as possible? And how do I determine where to invest, how to dial in and tune, and how to balance that coverage versus speed, because my goal is safety with some security built in. Thoughts on this, Chris?
Yeah, I think you're spot on here. I mean, this is a great definition of security in the pipeline with all the right stuff that I'm expecting to see and all the right things happening in the right places. So let's keep going and get ready to dive into the.
All right. So this is all you, the end of DAST. So have at it.
So yeah, I mean, you referenced my LinkedIn post and where I highlighted my thoughts, and it also ended up pointing to a blog post as well about the demise of DAST. And so it wasn't a very popular opinion with certain folks in our industry, but that's okay. Like, I feel like my job now in the application security industry is to ask hard questions, throw out opinions, and I'd love people to challenge me and challenge my thinking here. And so here is my reasoning for why I don't think DAST works in a DevOps/DevSecOps world. And ultimately, I'm going to make an argument for why I don't think you should use DAST at all at this time. So first of all, when we talk about speed, Brian already alluded to the joke about the DAST scan taking a week. I wish that was just a joke, that the technology behind DAST can literally take a week to scan a running web application. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen in different large enterprise environments where people are using DAST. And that just doesn't work in a DevOps pipeline. It's very easy to see why that doesn't work. Because you can't scan effectively a pull request worth of code changes with DAST, you can only scan the running application from end to end. you just can't move fast enough. I can't even have a scan that it can't take 20 minutes. I need something to scan in seconds. Maybe I can give you 10 or 20 seconds, but I can't give you 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Developers have to get the feedback that they need to be able to improve their code and get something to production. So let's now think about the results that come out of this. And so I'll tell you a story. So a few years ago, I was tasked with deploying a DAST for a particular web application. And just cards on the table, I was forced to do this because it was a contractual requirement. I would have never installed DAST if it wasn't being forced on me by a particular contract. And so I went and looked at a couple of different DAST providers, and I had them scan against a API-driven backend with a JavaScript framework front end. And what I found was the results that I got from these scans had zero value for me. These things didn't detect anything of value. They told me I was missing some headers and things that I knew were actually there because they were being added by my RASP behind the scenes, and I could prove it. They told me I had open ports. They had things like I had port 443 open. Really? Oh, port 443. Great. Thank you for that high critical style finding to come out of a tool. Of course, I have port 443 open because that's where my application answers requests. And so what I found in that exploration of looking at the different capabilities is I just didn't see the value coming out of it. I didn't see the return on investment for the amount of money I was paying for the tool versus the fidelity of the results that were coming out of it. And so really my third and final point, when I'm living in the modern web, if I am practicing proper limiting the application, limiting the scope of what I'm running, and I do that as a security professional, I recommend this by saying, let's take a container that we're going to use to run our application and scale it down. Don't give me anything that I don't need. And then we're using a up-to-date web-based JavaScript framework. When I put these two things together, there's just not very much that I think DAST is going to find. And so my conclusion to my argument here is I can't, in good faith, as an application security practitioner and as a security professional for 26 years, I can't recommend that people spend money on DAST tools against the web.
I think it's interesting, your argument, thinking about it from there's really, what I'm hearing is sort of two vectors. One is, can the thing even run in the span of time that I need in the seconds and minutes? And there's a physics problem there. Yep. There's another interesting point you're making around is there actually any value to actually find real meaningful findings that I actually would address, right? Or like your port example.
Yep.
And so, I agree that high quality application architecture using modern tools, updated code, has an SCA running behind it for the third-party code risk, right? RASP in production, those sorts of things. I think there's a good place people can get to, and I do think there are real challenges in the web DAST world. That being said, I think there are some organizations I wouldn't want them to take away, hey, if I've got SCA and SAST, I'm done, right? So this is more of a, make sure you do all of these other things when you either take out your DAST or don't bother to add it. Now, in our world, we actually started as a DAST. So I'm going to say that mobile is different. And let's talk about how mobile is different. And I'll talk about it from the perspective of our experiences with using mobile DAST. So in our world, we deliver a single run SAST, DAST, IAST combo. So I'm really speaking about them together because they're not broken apart. So in our world, we take an app binary from the CI/CD that's just been built, and we run a pass, and it's going to reverse it and look at the binary source. Then it's going to load it on a device, and it runs DAST and IAST combined together. So IAST is inside collecting telemetry, DAST is outside as the automator collecting telemetry, and they merged all together to give a result set. So it would be like surgery to take those pieces apart. But when we look at what's happening, we do operate in that 10, 15 minute time frame to get SAST, DAST, and IAST of an app that's freshly built. For most pipelines who are doing daily builds, that's fast enough overnight, right? From that perspective. What's interesting is the ROI piece that you brought through. So if I take a step back, we have a mass scanner that downloads and bulk analyzes apps in the App Store. There's 6.5 million apps in the App Store. Sort of not quite 3 million iOS, about 3.5 million Android. So we've downloaded millions of those apps and we run our scanning engine against them because that helps us understand patterns in the industry. That we also can license that data to threat modeling companies or threat intel companies or cybersecurity companies, what have you. So when you dig through that swarm of data, as I presented recently at an OWASP event, what we actually find is that 48% of all apps in the public app store have network-based vulnerabilities. They have improper cert pinning, they're not doing host name validation, they're not doing crypto correctly or what have you. What's interesting about that data is twofold. One is that the majority of the findings for network are actually dynamically are DAST and IAST oriented findings, meaning you can't find them in static, you need to run it really to find it. The other interesting thing is I think that says most people aren't doing DAST on mobile. Because if they were, we wouldn't have found either that or they're accepting these, CVSS high vulnerabilities, right? So if you've got a certificate pinning failure, that's going to score like a 7.8, 8.1 CVSS score, and you're going to want to deal with that. So there's this interesting dichotomy of, I actually think a lot of the world looks at it the way you do, and they're not using DAST on mobile. But in mass scale analysis, we're discovering an interesting vulnerability pattern that we find predominantly because we're using DAST to analyze it. So in our world, using this combo of SAST, DAST, and IAST does give you, can meet a 10 to 20 minute cycle. It can't meet a second cycle, right? So if you need to be ultra fast, that's not this world. There's no DAST that's going to give you seconds the way an SCA or a SAST might be able to do. And the way DAST work is they have to scan the whole thing, meaning you have to have a compiled binary. You're not working on a fragment of source, but SAST or SCA can look at a fragment of source. So there are some hurdles. You have to be far enough along building your app to be able to compile it in order to be able to use it. You have to have at least 10 minutes in your pipeline, a willingness of 10 minutes or more in your pipeline. And then you also have to decide whether you're going to authenticate it and how much of the app you're going to navigate. And so we have an automator that dynamically navigates the app to the best of our ability, but you can also take the time to script and navigate it. And that is more time invested in work you have to set up. And as app changes, you have to maintain it. So there can be long tail sort of maintenance differences. So I agree with you that DAST has its challenges. I think in the land of mobile, because most mobile testing is done on the binary, there's actually a way to make it work in the pipeline. We have a lot of customers using that way and all but the fastest use cases, right, in terms of making that work. So happy to have you come back comment on any of that.
No, I think it makes sense. And let me just read back what I heard and make sure I understood it correctly. So the average company that's building a mobile application is not pushing 5,000 versions a day, right? They're doing a nightly. So in the case of mobile, you've built a tool that fits within their pipeline because their pipeline is not pushing 2,000 changes like some of the big web applications do.
Exactly.
So it sounds like the approach you've taken still fits within the way that mobile applications are being built. And then you also have a coverage number here based on your public search that I can't make the same argument against mobile DAST that I did against web DAST by saying that the fidelity is just not there for my findings. It just doesn't find me anything of value. You've got data points that are showing that 48% of the mobile app store apps have insecure networking. Like that's real finding that does demonstrate value. So I would say based on this description and looking at it in this way that DAST on the mobile side, I see the differences now. And I would not make the same argument that I'm making against web applications because I think the environment is different and the quality of results is different based on the ability that you have to take the entire application and reverse engineer it and then use DAST and IS technologies against it.
So appreciate that thought back. I think in the end, it's up to the organization to decide what tooling is, the best tooling and what their security requirements are, right, in everything else. There are challenges with DAST, whether it's web or mobile in terms of config and scripting and all that other good stuff, right? So it's not all roses and cherry bombs here, but We think that in the mobile world, given the architecture and the modern tech, there are some things we can do. Now, the mobile's not scanning the back end, right? So you still have to think about, what about the back end half? What about API security? What about, things happening on the back end that where mobile's probing on the client side? There is no DAST or IS that's probing the server side. Most mobile apps are using the web app back end to create the mobile, right? So you still have to be smart on the back end, and whether you're going to use DAST on the back end or an API sec tool, SCA, all those rules still apply to the other chunk of code that's still living behind the firewall. So
yeah, and I think that's my next investigation. The next part of the journey that I need to go on is to evaluate some of the API specific security tools that are out there. And maybe that's where this is going to land. Maybe DAST is dead, but API sec is the future. I don't have that conclusion yet because I haven't done the analysis and run those tests to see if the API security tools that exist on the market that are scanning the web backends can give me DevOps speed, high fidelity results, and can find problems in my very tightly constrained application. So that'll be the next leg in the journey for me.
I think that's a really great point. In our world, we sort of say, make sure you're using API sec, but we haven't dissected the API sec space. Wanted to toss one more thing in here. So I was sort of lunatic about a year and a half ago and announced that we could automate pen testing in the pipeline, and I got slammed for that. And what I was trying to say was, there's this interesting world where you could use part automation and part human interaction to close gaps for certain scenarios, right? So no one in the right mind would say, it takes 2 weeks to do a pen test, so I'm going to do a pen test every day. I mean, that just is not reality. Forget about 5,000 pushes that you mentioned earlier, right? But there's this interesting world where I might be doing relatively rapid innovation. Maybe I have releases once a week or every other week, and I do need some deeper analysis, but I don't have time, money, or effort to do pen testing. And so one of the things we've come up with is what we call guided testing, is a hybrid DAST with a human. So basically what happens is your CI builds the app. The app then pings an analyst and says, I'm about to run. And a human analyst will sit there with a real device while the DAST runs, and the human will do some of the UI nav on behalf of the developer. So for example, maybe you're adding a new shopping cart, or you've overhauled some new feature, or you have a brand new application. The human can sit there, and while the SAS, DAST, and IAST are running, the human can do some app nav for you. You don't have to script it. They just boom, 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 do it. Now that takes a 10-minute scan to maybe 15 minutes, depending on how many screens in the app they're going to navigate. Most people don't navigate the whole app. But what you now have is this interesting hybrid thing that we call guided. And we have a number of customers that have adopted this, who are doing tier 1 high-risk apps that are getting updated on like a bi-weekly basis. Imagine a banking app, right? So having the assurance that whenever a banking app adds a new feature every 2 weeks or something like that, that a human is going to help navigate those new pieces of the app and process, allows you to have mostly automated scan with a little bit of human augmentation, gives you efficiency, gives you coverage, and so on and so forth. It can also be used nicely for regression testing, just to make sure you didn't screw something up. So this guided thing is something we kind of launched on the world last year, and encourage people to have a look at that. It's this interesting hybrid. If you're doing kind of medium speed, medium volume, there's a way to bring some human interaction and human ingenuity navigation in while still getting a mostly automated experience. I think we're going to see more and more things like this, where you have tests chunked. So you have a chunk of testing that's done either by a human or a system as we evolve. Clearly, the idea of SCA, which is scanning your code before you bring it into your repo, is a way to chunk up the testing. And this is another way to kind of chunk pieces of testing for certain high-risk use cases. So Chris, I don't know if we talked about this guy. This is kind of a new animal that we kind of birthed last year that's getting some traction.
Yeah, and I see the benefit of being able to use the technology you have to reverse engineer the mobile application is a way to really speed up the pen testing process. Because if I could when I think about the web application world, I always have to, as a pen tester, I have to interact with the running version of this in production. And so I have to work my way through the network to get there. But if I could take a web application and bring it into a constrained environment where I could reverse engineer and pick it apart and then attack it at a high rate of speed, I could see that being a very beneficial thing. And so what you've done on the mobile side makes sense to me, because you've got the control of that mobile application. You can speed things up versus, having to try to attack things from a long distance
A
away.
broad long distance. So looking at our time, reminder, you can Q&A us on the tail end here. Use the Q&A tab. We'll go through things at the end. So is the answer DAST and DevSecOps? Yes or no, Chris?
I think what I've learned in this discussion with you is it depends, which is always what you want to hear at the end of a debate, right? You want to hear someone. I would say from a web perspective, I'm going to say DAST and DevSecOps is no. But I would say you've convinced me DAST and DevSecOps on the mobile app side, based on the arguments that you made about the results that you're finding in scanning public apps, and the speed in which you can do it, and how that fits into the life cycle of how people build mobile apps today. I'll check the box for yes for DAST and DevSecOps on the mobile side, but no on the web app side at this point.
I think you've convinced me how rough DAST is, especially in a high volume, massive code change. Like, I hadn't really thought about the extreme edges of the bell curve, right? When it comes to either web or mobile, right? So while I believe that DAST works great for scenarios where you have a full app and you can afford 10 or 15 minutes, it still doesn't solve the mass rapid update in the same day volume thing, right? In that world, you're probably using SCA SAST and maybe IAST a little bit to try to figure that out. So kind of with you, and I love a really good debate. So we're going to kind of work our way through here. So you got some resources for folks. Where can they find you?
So I like to highlight the various Army or mass collection of podcasts that I'm a part of now. We've got Application Security Podcast, Security Table, and Threat Modeling Podcast. I also do a newsletter now called Reasonable Application Security. So please sign up for that. All these resources are free and available on the internet.
So we got a few for you as well. Just a few weeks ago, we launched our updated NowSecure Academy version 3.0. You can jump into that. That's basically free online training. So whether you're a developer, a security analyst, or new to mobile appsec, sign up, take it for free. It's all great. There's also some paid certification courses if you actually want to get the letter and the stamp of approval. GitHub, we're doing a lot with GitHub. When you think about developer first security, the way GitHub has embedded security into the workflow, and GitHub is quite interesting. I was actually surprised to see how high GitHub and GitLab, for example, ranked in the latest Gartner Magic Quadrant for AST tools. So have a look at that. This will take you right to the repo, and you can take a look at what it's like to do mobile security scanning built into your GitHub repo. You can do it on a pull or a push. You can do it on a build, and feed that information quickly, including code locations and remediation instructions, all that fun stuff, make your life easier. We had a really cool tech talk a couple weeks ago. So our co-founder, Andrew Hogue, and one of our solutions engineers with an application developer background, they cracked open GitHub and used Copilot as a code assistant in writing a simple iOS and a simple Android app. And there's some really interesting experiences they had on the journey of how things like Copilot can provide coding assistance, but you still have to be careful and you still have to test your code, no matter what AI tool you're using on the planet, right? And I think we've all learning pretty quickly that the large language model AIs leave something to be desired when it comes to actual facts and accuracy. So make sure you're still testing. But that's a cool Tech Talk series. You can sign up. There's a whole bunch of them coming. Next month, we're doing MITRE mobile attack updates. So the team from MITRE is going to be on board, share with us how MITRE mobile attacks being updated this year as well. So sign up for those Tech Talks. So it does time for Q&A. As we said earlier, you can ask questions as we go. We will leave the Q&A box up as we dig through the questions here. Let me get the question window open on my phone. So this is for you since it's web. So is DAST for web salvageable? What would need to happen to change your mind about web DAST?
Oh, that's a great question, and people might guess what I might answer this with, but maybe not. So I would say, to make DAST salvageable, the first thing I need to see is we need to find a way to scan an individual PR. Somebody, I'm going to give a startup idea here. Somebody can go build this. I don't have time to do it. We need a way to mock up the entire application other than the code that was changed. so that DAST could scan just the pinpoint, the thing that was changed in a given PR. Because if you could do that, you could actually do DAST at a high rate of speed. Now, I realize that's probably a difficult thing for people to do, and that's maybe why no one's done it so far. But that's really what I see as the solution to getting DAST to run in the DevOps pipeline at a high rate of speed. We also got to work on the fidelity of the results. We got to get a better engine that gives me real actionable things, because developer time costs money, and I can't be sending developers tickets for things that a DAST scanning tool is finding today that's just not providing enough value.
It's a good way to kind of problem solve too. Is there a world where this tech could be used if it evolved? Actually, Mike, I got a question here. What about, so for a mobile app, you can only work with a binary. What can you do with the developer? So that's a good question. So what we've been doing, like with GitHub in our plugin using either GitHub Advanced Security or a native interface, is that as the developers are working, all they need to do is build the app, and then on pull or push request, we can then run the scan. So that allows them to get that faster feedback loop on their own, or wait for the CI process to merge everybody's code changes in, and so on and so forth. We have some new capabilities we'll be bringing to market later this year that further simplify and enable pre-scanning for developers to identify kind of guardrails as they're writing their code. So here are most common errors that we find, app store blockers that we find, things like that nature. And what we want to do is be able to kind of be a developer assistance around security, privacy, and safety. So that even before they check the original code in that they write, we've picked up either there's an issue in this third-party library, or the way you configured this, Apple's going to block when you try to upload it, or what have you. So trying to find ways to be developer assistance as opposed to trying to lump all of security on the developer. So it seems like threat modeling would slow down the velocity of software development. How does threat modeling fit with DevSecOps? A good question for you there, Chris.
Yeah, threat modeling fits with DevSecOps, as I mentioned during the webinar here. At the time when you're, as a developer engineer, grabbing a piece of work, because even in a DevOps world where we're moving 100 miles an hour or 150 kilometers an hour, when we're moving fast, there is still a time where we're grabbing a piece of work, we're reading, we're analyzing, we're assessing, what am I supposed to be building? What is the product manager asking me to create? Or what is the bug that I'm trying to fix? That's the moment where we can embed threat modeling in a DevOps world. Because when we look at that definition, we come up with a design in our head for what we're going to change. That's the moment where we can ask ourselves, hey, what could go wrong with this thing? How would I adjust it so that that thing isn't a challenge? That's really the beauty of threat modeling, and that's where it fits into the DevOps world.
Well, that's awesome. I will take the last one, which is the classic, how do you get developers to pay attention to security, right? So we've talked a lot kind of about developers in this conversation. I think there are many views on that. We have some good assets around building a security champions. That's one way to go. One of the other ways to go actually came out of a really interesting conversation I had yesterday that had to do with how an organization is focusing on developer requirements. So their security analysts work with their product managers and their architecture teams to make sure they have clear requirements for security. And then they coach developers when they have questions on those requirements. And that's turned out to be a way to kind of gradually pull PULL developers into writing more secure code. And they're doing it in partnership with the architects and the PMs so that the stories that they're submitting either have security baked into them or they're specific security stories. Like this application must have two-factor authentication because it has XYZ sensitive data in it. This application must encrypt data over the network because of blank. I mean, that one feels pretty obvious, but I'll put that out there. This one must be tamper resistant, therefore needs to include anti-tampering tools such as one of the following, right? So think about the requirements layer as a way to bring developers in. The other thing to think about is related to something Chris said earlier, is that first SCA scan could freak everybody out because of how much it's going to find if you've got an old long tail app. So when we think about working with devs, do the crawl, walk, run, pick a handful of things that matter, train them on it, start feeding them tickets on that, test for that. Don't throw everything at them. You know, what if I know that I have, 10 or 20 verified vulnerabilities, pick the ones with the highest CVSS scores or the ones that have the high sensitive data risk, kind of work and coach on that and gradually build that relationship. Over time, you can probably build more automated testing and open the aperture of what you're going to feed developers in terms of, which security issues to fix. But, think about security champions, think about requirements, think about start small, grow gradually, think about teaching them through threat modeling, as Chris said earlier, and many of those different kinds of things will help with developers. Anything to add on helping developers pay attention from your experience, Chris?
No, I want to hear more about that requirements story. I think there's a future blog post or interview or something for you somewhere. Let's get that written down somewhere, because that's something that a lot of people would get a lot of benefit from, this idea of coaching. We need to get that story out to the world.
Well, it's interesting enough. I actually wrote down a note to talk with our product team about, given that we test for all these things, could we actually help our customers with tickets for all of them? Meaning not the break fix ticket, the feature requirement ticket.
Yeah.
Right. The non-functional or functional requirements with security aspects in them could be an interesting way to add more value. Right. So I'm with you in the blog post. There's a blog post, there's a book, there's a guide, a Git docs book, something in all of that I think I want to see if they'll let me inside to see more of what they're actually doing, or get them along on one of these sessions. So with that, we are finished today. Thanks so much, Chris, for joining us again for another monthly DevSecOps bunch. It was a lot of fun talking about the pros and cons of DevSecOps. So with that, parting words, Chris?
I would just say it's always a pleasure, Brian, to have the opportunity to discuss application security, and I look forward to seeing you soon at another event somewhere around the world.
There you go, Chris. Thanks very much. There are OWASP events and threat modeling events happening later this year. I'll stick that out there, so people might want to pay attention to those coming. And of course, we'll be here back next month with our DevSecOps bunch and our Tech Talk. So thanks again for joining us, Chris. Another fun session. See you again soon. Goodbye, everybody.